Well, it's finally time. The Rose of Versailles movie adaptation has been released on Netflix, and naturally, as someone who has made 3 videos discussing the Rose of Versailles, 2 on just news regarding this film, and 1 recently going over the original 1979 anime, I kind of had to make a video as soon as I could going over my thoughts on this film, because I do have thoughts, and I think it's important to discuss, is this movie good? Is it not so good? Is it something you should watch before the anime? Is it something you should watch after? So what we're going to do is we're going to discuss what I thought about the film and try to view it on its own without making too many direct comparisons to what was specifically cut out of the original. Towards the end of the video, we'll do a section where we'll talk about specific things that were in the original anime that were cut out here, just because there are some thoughts I have on that. So where do we start with this? Number 1, it is an hour and 53 minutes long. Now, taking a 40 episode show and condensing it down to a movie was always going to be an interesting concept, because you are cutting out a lot. And while I have been on record saying that the original Rose of Versailles anime definitely had a lot of stuff that could be trimmed down and cut out, especially stuff in the middle of its run, a perfect version of the Rose of Versailles, a perfect new adaptation, would probably be like 25 episodes, somewhere around there, maybe a little bit more, maybe a little bit less. Certainly not one less than 2-hour movie, because a 2-hour movie is, 6 episodes? That's not a lot of time. There were hopes that maybe it would be longer, maybe it would be like a 2.5-hour movie, or maybe even like a 3-hour movie, a la something like Disappearance of Haruhi, which is close to that, or that we would get maybe 3 movies, like a trilogy. Definitely that would have been better. I think a movie trilogy would have been more ideal, because then you would have had, even if they were only 2 hours, that would be like the equivalent of 18 episodes. That would have been still certainly probably more rushed than it needed to be, but it would have gotten you more of a complete adaptation, I think. I mean, the bottom line is, the more time you have within reason, the more you're going to be able to cover. And I think even if you have not experienced the Rose of Versailles prior to watching this film, it is unfortunately going to feel rushed. That is something that I think just comes with the territory. It's something that should be expected, given what this is, a condensed down adaptation of a much longer piece of media. But if you're not expecting that, I could see it being a disappointment. You know, I've had the idea of this movie in my head for a long time, even before it was announced, because we had that original Toei planned Rose of Versailles movie from back in like 2007 that never got off the ground. So I went into this expecting it to feel a bit rushed, and it is. But I could see people being disappointed if they were not expecting that, if they don't know anything about the Rose of Versailles manga or the Rose of Versailles anime from the 1970s. If they don't know anything about that and they're just watching this blind because it's the new thing on Netflix, yeah, I could see people walking away from it feeling rushed, feeling like stuff is missing, because it is. That being said, I think that given the constraints that any sort of movie adaptation were going to have placed on it inherently, I think for the most part, they clearly had a pretty decent idea of how they wanted this film structured and what they wanted to keep in to make that structure work. And one of the things they did to facilitate that was make this film, as many people have probably heard, a musical. Now, for the most part, I don't think the description of a musical is entirely accurate, because whenever a song is going on in the film, it's usually not the characters literally in universe breaking out into song and dance. It is mostly like having a music video play to effectively carry across whatever the characters are thinking. And yes, it is the actors singing. It's either the voice actors who play these characters, or they specifically get a singing voice for that character. But it's in sort of like, I don't know if you call it like a dream sequence or in like a montage. It's not like, oh, we're going to see the characters in universe start singing. With one exception. One of the songs towards the end does literally have the characters in the world start singing. And that one definitely is very musical-like. And that is what I had expected when I had heard it was going to be a musical. I thought every song was going to be like that. But only the one really is. Does that make a difference to most people? I don't know. I could see the concern for a lot of people being that having the characters break into song would be distracting. It would make it feel like you're watching a play on stage rather than an actual film. For the most part, I did not get that impression. It really is just that one song towards the end. So I was not particularly bothered by it, especially because generally I liked the songs and I thought the singing was good. So I did not mind it. But I know the notion of it being a musical is probably going to turn some people off inherently. And I want to try and reassure you, it's not characters stopping what they're doing and singing like they're on a stage. It's not like that. It's really just the one And for the most part, I don't think it's that distracting or problematic. I actually, to be honest, think it's kind of ingenious given what this movie is trying to do. It doesn't have the time to properly establish all these characters and all of their feelings and thoughts. You just don't have the runtime for it. So I think the concept of having the characters quite literally express their feelings in song in order to convey important ideas and background thoughts for these characters, when you just don't have the time to do it naturally over a long period of time like you would in a show, is a really smart idea. Do I think it's going to satisfy everybody? Of course not. But I think it is a very effective way of condensing things. What I don't necessarily think worked out as well was the decision to frame the film as a tale of 4 characters specifically. Those characters being, of course, Oscar, Andre, Marie Antoinette, and Axel von Fersen. When we initially learned that that was going to be the main focus of the film, I did not think it was a bad idea, because that means you're narrowing it down to them and cutting out a lot of other characters. I thought that that made sense. I thought that that was a good game plan for the film to have. After actually watching the film, I actually think it should have been trimmed down even more. And I know that that sounds contradictory because I just talked about how the film probably should have been longer. It should have had more time to flesh things out better. But what I mean is, instead of focusing on those 4 characters, it should have only focused on 3. It should have just focused on Oscar, Andre, and Marie Antoinette. Von Fersen gets a lot of screen time. He's not there for the entire film, just like he isn't there for the entire anime. But he is very prominent. And on the one hand, that makes him a rather fleshed out character for the most part, despite the fact that, again, this is a short film. But his screen time and his focus, I think, ends up being a detriment to the film. And that's because time spent on him is time not spent developing other characters and their relationships. So much of the first half of the film is developing his relationship with Marie Antoinette and his relationship with Oscar. And not to say that those are not important, and they're certainly very important in the original anime. But because so much time is spent on those 2 relationships, other relationships take a back seat during the first half of the film. Most notably, Oscar's relationship with Andre, which really does not get proper focus until the second half of the film, and Oscar's relationship with Marie Antoinette, which I honestly feel like is one of the biggest misses this film has, which is not properly developing that bond. And I think the only reason that those 2 relationships, those 2 incredibly important relationships, not just in the original anime, but in this film, do not get the development they need, is because Fersen takes up that screen time instead. And I really do believe the smarter thing to do in hindsight would have been to either cut Fersen out entirely, or to at the very least significantly scale down his role to just the bare essentials. Cut out his relationship with Oscar and just kind of have his romance with Marie Antoinette be there, but not be a primary focus. I understand why it's valuable. It's valuable as an insight into Oscar's character, showing that, hey, this is someone that did not even know that Oscar was a woman at first and really did not even see Oscar as a woman. And that's something that frustrated Oscar, because Oscar really liked Fersen at one point and probably would have married Fersen at that point in her life if that option had been available. And we do get, I think, a powerful music video showing Oscar's feelings regarding that situation and showing kind of the struggle she has with her femininity versus this masculine role that she's taken on. It is important for her character, but it's not important in the grand scheme of this film. And certainly not more important than the bonds that she should have had with Marie Antoinette and Andre that do take a back seat so that they can focus on her bond with Fersen. Similarly, even though, yes, Marie Antoinette's romance with Fersen is very important, it's important to show that her expectations for what her life would be as the queen were not entirely lived up to, because Louis was not the kind of person that she was expecting, whereas Fersen more so fits the mold of the kind of person she thought her husband would be. It's very relevant in the context of the anime, but even in the film, it is still important, even though King Louis doesn't play a big role and he really only gets like 1 scene to converse with Marie about all this. It is still important. It's just the sort of thing that I think could have still kept in without spending so much time on Fersen, because I think it is way more important to the original story and to this film to establish and develop Oscar's relationship with Marie Antoinette and Oscar's relationship with Andre instead. And had the film done that from the get-go and had that trio be the focus for the entire thing and their bonds be the focus for the entire thing, it would have flowed a lot better and would have accomplished a lot more. Because having Oscar's relationship with Andre really not be a primary focus until the second half of the film, even though it does become like the primary focus from that point on, it does feel kind of jarring because Andre just is kind of there as like a background character for the most part. Not to say that he isn't relevant, not to say that he doesn't have lines of dialogue, but he doesn't feel like that important of a character during the first half. And it is kind of weird as someone who has seen the original anime to see that happen. And given how important his relationship with Oscar is, it is very strange that their bond was not focused on more in the first half of the film. I do think that it makes a lot of the emotional weight regarding their relationship in the second half feel a little bit empty, or at least more empty than it should. And with regards to Marie Antoinette, I really think that relationship, that bond is the one that struggles the most because I never really felt like in this film, she and Oscar had a particularly strong relationship. Yes, you get some of Marie Antoinette admiring Oscar in the beginning. You get Marie Antoinette saying, "Oh, Oscar, if only you were a man," right? You get that stuff, but it feels very surface level. And so much of their interactions, even in the first half, are kind of just Oscar giving Marie Antoinette advice and her either blowing Oscar off or kind of giving her lip service. And as the film goes on, you see she is less and less willing to hear Oscar out and consider Oscar's perspective. And yes, that is character growth. It's showing, not in a positive way, but showing how Marie Antoinette is getting more and more tyrannical, showing her becoming this person that Oscar really wanted her not to become. You know, Oscar was trying to avoid her going down this path, and yet she ended up there anyway. That is tragic, and it's supposed to be tragic, but it doesn't feel as tragic as it should because it never felt like Oscar ever really had her ear in the way that she should have, and it never really felt like their bond was as strong as it should have been because the film was too busy focusing on Fersen. I think if you cut him out or reduced him and spent the first half of the film focusing primarily on Oscar and Marie's relationship while still building up her bond with Andre, it would have made the hits in the second half feel all the more impactful because you're supposed to feel something when Oscar and Marie Antoinette ultimately part ways. That is supposed to be a big emotional moment. These people who were once so close are now on such completely opposite sides. When Oscar becomes a revolutionary and Marie Antoinette hears about this, it's supposed to hit you. It's supposed to be a deeply emotional moment, and it really isn't. It does prevent the second half of the film from being as impactful as it should be. And that's not to say that it isn't still impactful to an extent. It just could have been a lot better. After watching this film and sitting down and reflecting on it, the best thing that could have been done to improve the pacing, to improve the emotional impact, to improve the exploration of these characters and their bonds and the development of those bonds would have been to significantly reduce Fersen's role. With that out of the way, what do I think of this film? Do I think it is worth watching? I think if you are someone who has seen the original anime or the manga, this is going to feel like a greatest hits fan service type of production because it is well animated. It does have the nice music video type songs, and it isn't a difficult thing to consume. But I do think it is not going to fully satisfy someone who is expecting it to hit in the same way that the original anime or manga did. One thing that I've always brought up as the greatest strength of the original anime was how well it handled the tone of the lead up to the French Revolution, the dread in the atmosphere, and this film really does not capture that. The closest thing to it is that the colors of the visuals start out very bright and colorful early on, which you could say represents Marie Antoinette's wide-eyed, impressionable, optimistic attitude towards her new life, and the colors get a little bit duller towards the end, but not to a significant enough degree that I necessarily think it was intentional in terms of trying to create a darker atmosphere for the events that were going on. So because this doesn't capture that tone as well as the original, I definitely think it is, in that way alone, not going to live up to the original, regardless of all the other concerns I've already talked about. So if you are expecting this to be on the same level as the original, you're going to be disappointed. But if you go into it with your expectations in check, and you know, yes, it's going to be rushed. Yes, it's going to be paced awkwardly. Yes, it's going to be a pseudo musical, but hey, it's still going to be pretty good. It's still going to have a lot of the same emotional beats, even if they aren't as strong. It's still going to have roughly the same ending, and it's going to be well animated at the same time. I think you will get something out of this. I think you will still enjoy the experience, even if it doesn't hit as hard as you would probably want it to. If you're someone who has watched this film, but has not experienced anything else Rose of Versailles, I don't think that watching this film will prevent you from enjoying the original. I think ideally, I would recommend you watch the original and then watch this. I do think that despite knowing generally what's going to happen, because things don't play out exactly the same way, you will still get a lot out of it, and you'll be able to enjoy a lot of the things that were trimmed out. I understand it's harder to come across. I understand it is from 1979. But if you enjoyed this film in any way, you owe it to yourself to watch the original. So at this point, with that out of the way, I do want to cover a few specific comparisons between this and the original anime, and it will spoil things for the original anime if you haven't seen it. So this is the point in the video to stop if you have not seen the original anime. If you have, then let's keep going. I think I kind of have to talk about Rosalie, right? You know, I've talked multiple times about how any sort of film adaptation would have to basically cut out Rosalie almost entirely, and this very nearly does. In fact, it cuts out Rosalie a lot more than even I was expecting, which is kind of surprising because I thought she was basically going to have almost her entire role removed, other than her historical role and maybe her relationship with Bernard. But even those two things are not included. In fact, Rosalie in this film is not even named. She is just a background character and honestly could have been completely cut out and it would not have changed a single thing. She could have just been a generic bystander. The only way you would even suspect, if you haven't seen the original, that she would be in any way a relevant character is just the fact that in the scene where she appears, she is dressed very specifically and colored very specifically, and most of the other characters are not. They're just kind of drawn like background characters, and it's really just like her, Oscar, and Andre who aren't. So that might give some people a hint that, oh, this character seems important, and then they'd be wondering why she never shows up again in the rest of the film. She doesn't even have her name in the credits either, and that really is surprising to me. I thought at the very least she would be introduced when Bernard got introduced, who I also thought would have a much larger role. But Bernard at least has a couple appearances, he is at least named, and he does at least get to sing a song, so that's something. In fact, it's the song that is the most musical-like in the film. But Rosalie does not even have her historical role as Marie Antoinette's kind of attendant maid thing when she's about to be executed. And that's because that entire aspect is cut out of the film. You know, the end of the film is basically just the montage, right? It's this montage of historical paintings and stuff like that with dialogue on screen telling us what happens. And that is not a great way to end a film. It might be a better way to end it than the anime, because the anime just kind of stopped as the narrator was giving exposition. So both kind of have that issue of let's end with a bunch of exposition. But I really do think it was kind of a detriment to not show us Marie Antoinette's execution, see her reflecting on stuff that happened. Yes, the original anime didn't focus on it all that much in the grand scheme of things, but it focused on it more than the film did. And I'm not sure why it decided to go in that direction, not just spend a few minutes showing us those events. If you're ending your film with a montage and just text on screen telling people what happened, it's generally not a good thing. So I was very stunned that Rosalie had her role reduced as much as she did. I thought she would at the very least be a supporting character and fill her historical role, but she didn't even do that. And because she's cut out, because Bernard is very heavily reduced in terms of his role, they basically had to rework how Andre has his eyesight damaged. And I don't think they did a bad job of that, because they still kept the emotional weight of it, because the entire Black Knight plot is just cut out. So I think it works well enough because you have to sort of trim that down. But it is just interesting how much that plot thread and how much Bernard and Rosalie were reduced in terms of their relevance. And then the other thing I really want to talk about is Oscar's disease is just completely cut out of this film. And I was very surprised that happened. I remember when I was watching the film, I kept expecting them to bring it up, and then they never did. And on the one hand, it kind of makes sense because Oscar dies of, a bunch of gunshot wounds. She doesn't die of this disease, so it's arguably unnecessary to have that additional emotional weight when you're trying to cut things down, so I get why they did it. But I do think that having that disease kind of affected Oscar's decision-making and judgment, her perspective on things. It does take something away from her to not have that weighing on her mind. But on the other hand, yes, I understand it's not how she dies, so why even include it if you're trying to trim things out? In a sense, you could argue cutting it out actually makes things a little bit more tragic, because had Andre not died, had Oscar not died, they could have had a long, happy life. Whereas in the original anime, Oscar has a shortened lifespan. We don't know how short, from what I recall. We aren't even told what disease it is specifically, but the implication is, yes, she is not going to live a long, full life anyway, which again, very well may have affected her decision-making. So in a sense, it makes the movie more tragic because it didn't have to end up that way for Oscar. And I suppose the last thing I want to touch on is the ending itself, which again is not all that different from the anime in terms of like what happens to Oscar. The only difference, and it is a relatively minor one in the grand scheme, but Oscar does not die before the Bastille falls. She actually lives long enough to see it happen. And I think that is more of a fulfilling ending for her, to have her actually see this thing that she was trying to fight for be achieved. I think that that is a more satisfying resolution than what the anime did, which again is a little bit more tragic, but I could see that maybe annoying some people that it isn't as sad as the anime is. I'm fine with it. I think it works well in the context of this film and gives it a more satisfactory resolution for her character, to see her die and yet get to see the thing that she died fighting for, rather than her not getting to live to see it. So those are just some quick thoughts on specific comparisons I didn't want to include in a quote-unquote spoiler-free section because I don't want to spoil certain aspects of the original. Nevertheless, those are my thoughts on this film, and I am very curious to see what other people think of it, if they are really let down by the pacing and what was cut out, if they have other ideas as far as what could have been kept in or what could have been slimmed down instead to make it flow better. So let me know what your thoughts are on it down below, and as always, thank you so much for watching. Like and subscribe if you enjoyed, and until next time, take care everyone. Look forward to the next video.